It started with the sound of a monitor beeping in a quiet hospital room. The soft, rhythmic sound echoed through the sterile space, a reminder of life continuing despite everything. In that room, a 14-year-old boy lay in bed, his body still, his eyes closed. His name was Jaden, but no one had heard him speak for 2 long years. The accident had been sudden and violent. Jaden had been on his way home from school, his mind buzzing with excitement about an upcoming test he had studied hard for. He had no way of knowing that this day would be the beginning of a nightmare. The crash had left him unconscious, trapped in a coma. The doctors had told his family that there was a good chance he would never wake up. They were unsure what kind of life, if any, he might have when he did. But Jaden's mother, Denise, refused to believe that. She refused to give up on him. Day after day, she sat by his side. She was there for him in ways no one else could understand. She held his hand for hours, whispered prayers into the stillness, and talked to him as if he could hear her. The nurses said it was the love of a mother, powerful, unbreakable. She told him stories about what he had missed, the funny things his little brother had done, how his dog was still waiting by the door for him, how his friends missed him. She spoke to him as though they had never been separated, as though he was only sleeping and would wake up soon. But 2 years passed, and Jaden remained silent. His body was kept alive by machines, but his mind was still far away. Denise's hope never wavered. She couldn't imagine a world without Jaden, her son, her everything. She had heard the doctor's concerns, of course. They told her that the chances of Jaden ever waking up were slim. But Denise would not let go. She loved him too much. She stayed by his side, even when it seemed like there was no reason to. She believed she knew that one day he would come back to her. And then one morning, everything changed. The sun had barely risen, casting a faint light across the hospital room. Denise had fallen asleep in the chair beside Jaden's bed, her hand still resting on his. The usual beeping of the heart monitor filled the silence. But something was different today. The sound changed. It was faint at first, but it was enough to wake Denise. She sat up quickly, rubbing her eyes. She glanced at the monitor, her heart skipping a beat. The beeping. It was faster. She leaned closer to Jaden, holding her breath. His chest rose and fell with shallow breaths, but now there was something more. His fingers twitched. A slight movement. Denise gasped, her heart pounding in her chest. Could it be? Was he really waking up? Jaden? She whispered, her voice trembling with hope. Jaden, can you hear me? For a moment, there was nothing. Then, just as Denise was about to speak again, she saw his eyelids flutter. Slowly, his eyes opened, blinking against the bright light of the room. At first, they were unfocused, but then they started to focus on her. His mom. Mom? His voice was weak, barely audible. But it was enough. Denise froze, her hand still on his. She couldn't believe it. After 2 long years, he was awake. Tears filled her eyes as she whispered his name. Jaden, my baby. You're awake? Jaden's eyes, though still heavy with sleep, tried to focus on her face. His lips parted, but only a hoarse whisper came out. Mom. The sound of his voice, so soft, so fragile, was the most beautiful sound she had ever heard. She leaned in closer, pressing her forehead against his. I'm here, Jaden. I'm here. I'm so glad you're back. Jaden blinked slowly, looking around the room. He seemed confused, his eyes darting from one corner to another. The machines, the white walls, the bright lights, all of it seemed unfamiliar to him. Denise smiled through her tears, trying to reassure him. You're in the hospital, sweetie. You've been asleep for a long time, but you're awake now. You're safe. Jaden turned his head slightly, as though trying to piece together the fragments of his memory. But then, a sudden flash of recognition crossed his face. His eyes widened, his breathing quickened. He turned to look at her, and his voice, although still weak, carried an edge of fear. "Mom," he said, his voice trembling with a new urgency. "There's something I need to tell you." Denise's smile faltered slightly. She could hear the tremor in his voice and saw the fear in his eyes. He had just woken up after all, and his mind was still adjusting to everything. "It's okay, Jaden," she whispered, trying to calm him. "You're safe now. You don't need to worry about anything." But Jaden shook his head, his hand gripping hers tightly. "No, Mom. You don't understand. There's something you need to know. Something I remember." The urgency in his voice, the way his body tensed, made Denise feel uneasy. What could he possibly remember? What was it that was making him so scared? "Jaden," Denise said softly, brushing his hair away from his forehead. "You're just waking up. You don't need to worry about anything right now. Just rest. We can talk later, okay?" But Jaden's eyes didn't leave her. They were wide and full of something that Denise couldn't quite understand. "No, Mom," he said, his voice shaking. I remember what happened that night. And it's not what you think. It's not the way you told them. I remember everything. And I'm scared." Denise felt her heart stop for a moment. She stared at him, her mind racing. What was he talking about? What could he remember? She had always told him that the accident had been an unfortunate mistake, something that happened in the blink of an eye. But now, Jaden was saying that wasn't true. He said he remembered something different, something horrifying. Denise tried to stay calm, but inside, she was panicking. This wasn't what she had imagined. Jaden had woken up, yes, but now he was talking about something that didn't make sense. She had been by his side for 2 years, comforting him, loving him. How could he be saying these things? Was he confused? Was this some kind of side effect from the coma? "Jaden, sweetie." She started, but her voice faltered. "You've been through so much. Maybe you're just a little confused right now. It's okay. You don't need to say anything." But Jaden squeezed her hand tighter. "No, Mom, I have to tell you. You need to know the truth. It wasn't an accident. You did something. You hurt me." Denise's breath caught in her throat. Her mind raced, trying to make sense of his words. What was he saying? What did he mean? Before she could say anything else, the door to the room opened and the doctor stepped in, followed by a nurse. Denise quickly wiped away the tears that had begun to spill down her face. She didn't want them to see her panic. Jaden had said something that didn't make sense, but she had to stay calm. She had to protect him. The doctor smiled, looking at Jaden. Well, looks like someone is finally awake." Jaden's gaze shifted from his mother to the doctor. His eyes were wide, his face pale. He looked terrified, as though something deep inside him was trying to break free. He opened his mouth to speak again, but before he could, Denise quickly placed a hand on his arm, her voice low but urgent. "Jaden, it's okay. Just rest now. You're safe here." But Jaden wasn't listening. His eyes locked with hers, and his voice came out in a whisper, full of fear and desperation. "It's you, Mom. You're the reason I was in that car. You—" But before he could finish, the doctor stepped forward, gently placing a hand on Jaden's shoulder. "Jaden, it's okay. Let's take things slow, all right? You've been through a lot. We'll talk later. You need rest." Denise felt a wave of relief wash over her. Thank goodness, the doctor was here. She could breathe again. Jaden was awake, but he was still confused. He didn't know what he was saying. He couldn't. It was all just a misunderstanding. But deep down, a small seed of doubt had been planted in Denise's mind. What if Jaden was right? What if there was more to that night than she had let herself believe? She shook her head. No, it wasn't possible. Jaden had been through a lot. He was confused. She was his mother. She had always been there for him. She had always loved him. Nothing would change that. But as the doctor spoke softly to Jaden and the nurse adjusted his blankets, Denise couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. And she couldn't help but wonder, just how much did Jaden really remember? Jaden's recovery was nothing short of a miracle. The doctors had prepared everyone for the worst, but now here he was awake, breathing, blinking, at the world that had changed so much while he was lost in the darkness of his coma. The hospital staff couldn't help but smile at the sight of him. They had seen many patients in their time, but Jaden's story was different. He had defied the odds. Denise, his mother, sat beside him, her tears of joy streaming down her face. She gently cupped his face in her hands, staring at him like she couldn't believe he was really there, alive. "I knew you'd come back to me," she whispered, her voice trembling with emotion. "I never stopped believing in you." Jaden didn't respond the way she expected. He simply stared at her with wide, dark eyes. His gaze was distant, as if he wasn't entirely sure who she was or perhaps if he even trusted her. There was something unsettling in the way he looked at her. He didn't smile. He didn't show any sign of recognition beyond that fleeting glance. His eyes were heavy, like he was still lost in some place far away. Denise held his hand tightly, her heart racing. "Jaden," she said softly, "I'm here. Everything is going to be okay now. You're home." But Jaden didn't respond. He didn't speak. His body seemed stiff, like he was holding back from anything, from anyone. Denise felt a chill run through her as she watched him. She had imagined this moment so many times, but now that it had come, it was nothing like she had expected. The nurses, who had seen so many patients wake from comas, tried to comfort Denise. "It's normal," one of them assured her. "He's been through a lot. His mind and body will need time to adjust." Denise nodded, though she wasn't completely convinced. She had expected Jaden to be confused, maybe frightened, but there was more to it. There was something off about the way he reacted, or rather, didn't react. He hadn't said a word. He hadn't smiled. All he had done was look at her with those wide, unreadable eyes. Days passed, and the hospital staff watched Jaden closely. They encouraged Denise to talk to him, to try and bring him back to the world around him. They told her that recovery would take time, but they were hopeful. Jaden had made it this far. Surely, he could continue to improve. But as the days passed, the cracks in the perfect picture began to appear. Jaden's condition wasn't as simple as they had hoped. While his body was healing, his mind seemed to be in a state of confusion, even fear. Denise rarely let anyone near him without her. She hovered around him, always near, always protective. She didn't want anyone to disturb his peace, especially not the doctors or nurses who had been a part of his treatment. One afternoon, a young nurse named Carla, who had been working in the hospital for just a few months, noticed something strange. She had been assigned to help with Jaden's care, and over the past few days, she had gotten to know him a little. He was always polite, though distant. He rarely spoke, and when he did, his voice was soft, almost too quiet to hear. That day, as Carla entered Jaden's room to check on his vitals, she noticed something odd. Jaden was sitting up in bed, his pen moving quickly across a notebook. He seemed absorbed in what he was writing, his face tense with concentration. Carla, curious but trying not to intrude, watched him for a moment. She had seen many patients in his condition, but none quite like him. "Hey, Jaden," Carla said gently, trying to sound casual. "What are you writing there?" Jaden didn't respond at first. He didn't even look up from the page. But then, after a moment of hesitation, he slowly lifted his hand and passed the notebook to her. His eyes darted toward the door, as if he was afraid someone might catch him doing something he wasn't supposed to. Carla took the notebook from him carefully, glancing at it with a mixture of curiosity and concern. As she looked down at the page, her heart skipped a beat. The words scrawled in shaky handwriting made her breath catch in her throat. "Help me." Carla stared at the words for a long moment, her mind racing. What did this mean? Was Jaden asking for help? Why hadn't he told anyone before? The nurse glanced at him, her heart aching as she saw the way his eyes flickered with fear. There was no doubt now, something was wrong. "Jaden," Carla said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "What's going on? Why did you write this?" Jaden's hands were trembling slightly, and he seemed to shrink into the bed as if trying to make himself as small as possible. He didn't look at Carla. His eyes were fixed on the door, still watching it nervously. I don't know," he whispered, his voice barely audible. I just need someone to know, please." Carla's heart broke for him. She had seen the pain in his eyes, but it was clear now that there was something deeper. Something he was hiding, something he couldn't say out loud. He was asking for help, but he didn't know how to explain what was wrong. Before she could ask him anything else, the door to the room opened, and Denise entered, her face lighting up when she saw Carla. "How's he doing today?" she asked, her voice full of hope. Carla quickly hid the notebook behind her back, her heart racing. "He's doing well," she said, forcing a smile. "Just getting some rest." Denise smiled and walked over to Jaden's bedside, her hands reaching out to touch his. "You're looking better every day, Jaden." "I'm so proud of you," she said, her voice warm and loving. Jaden didn't respond to her words. He simply stared at her with that same distant look in his eyes. Denise, sensing something was wrong, looked at Carla. "Is everything okay?" she asked, a hint of concern in her voice. Carla hesitated for a moment, unsure of how to answer. She didn't want to upset Denise, but she couldn't ignore the growing sense of unease. "He's just still adjusting," Carla said finally, her voice soft. "It's normal after being in a coma for so long. He might be a little confused or distant, but he's getting better every day." Denise nodded, though she still seemed uneasy. She leaned in closer to Jaden, brushing his hair from his forehead. "You're safe now, baby. You don't have to be scared anymore," she murmured. But Jaden didn't respond. He didn't even look at her. His eyes were locked onto the door, as if waiting for something or someone to enter. His body was stiff, his hands gripping the edges of the blanket tightly, as though bracing for something he couldn't escape. Carla watched the scene quietly, a deep sense of worry growing in her chest. There was something wrong, something she couldn't put her finger on. She had seen patients react to trauma in different ways, but Jaden's response, his fear, his reluctance to even acknowledge his mother, felt different. Over the next few days, the strange behavior continued. Jaden barely spoke, and when he did, it was only in short, nervous phrases. He didn't smile. He didn't seem happy to be awake. And whenever Denise tried to get close, he would tense up, his body going rigid. His mother, who had once been his world, seemed to be a stranger to him. Denise, of course, didn't notice the full extent of what was happening. She was too wrapped up in the idea of Jaden's recovery. She was too focused on the fact that he was alive, that she had him back. But to Carla and the other nurses, it was clear that something was off. They had seen enough to know that this wasn't just the result of a long coma. There was something more at play here. And as the days wore on, that feeling only grew stronger. Something was wrong, something that no one wanted to face. And slowly, very slowly, the hospital staff began to wonder what had really happened to Jaden on that fateful night. Carla couldn't shake the growing unease in her chest. It was becoming harder to ignore the strange tension that filled Jaden's room every time Denise was nearby. As a nurse, Carla had seen many cases, and she had dealt with all kinds of patients, some who were physically recovering, others mentally. But Jaden's situation was different. There was something about his mother's presence that didn't sit right. It wasn't just the constant hovering or the way she always seemed to be in control of the situation. It was the way Jaden reacted to her. Carla began to observe more closely. She noticed how Denise's smile never quite reached her eyes. It was as if she was forcing the happiness, trying to keep up the appearance of a loving mother, when there was something deeper beneath the surface. Carla also saw how Denise stood over Jaden, her shadow constantly looming over him, even when he didn't seem to want her there. Whenever Denise spoke, Jaden's body would tense, his hands clenching the blanket, as though trying to hold himself together. It was subtle at first, but the signs were there. Jaden flinched whenever Denise raised her voice. It wasn't the kind of response someone would expect from a boy who had just woken up from a 2-year coma. Denise's tone wasn't harsh, not in any way that seemed cruel. Yet, every time she spoke to him, it was as though Jaden couldn't help but shrink into himself. Carla couldn't ignore it any longer. There was something going on, something that wasn't being said. The way Jaden looked at his mother, the way he acted around her, was all wrong.